Okay, so good morning, everybody, and just letting one more person in. Here we go. Okay, so the Torah portion this week, it departs from the regular Shabbat Torah reading because it's Passover. So when a holiday coincides with Shabbat, the holiday supersedes Shabbat when it comes to Torah reading and Haftorah. But we recognize that it's Shabbat in terms of how many aliyot there are. So in other words, the holier the day, the more aliyot there are, the more subdivisions of the Torah reading there are. So the least holy of days is a Monday or Thursday weekday morning. 3 portions are read. If it's Rosh Chodesh, the new month, which is not a day of rest, but still an extra sacrifice was brought because it's the new month, 4 aliyot are read. All right, so total secular weekday, 3. Rosh Chodesh, 4. A holiday that falls during the week. So the first 2 days of Passover, last 2 days of Passover, or first 2 days of Sukkot, last 2 days of Sukkot, or just the 2 days of Shavuot. Those days, 5 aliyot are read. All right, so the Torah portion is divided into 5 portions. So first day of Passover, 5 aliyot, but no, it's Shabbat. So Yom Kippur, if it falls during the week, not on Shabbat, has 6. So that shows that Yom Kippur is holier than any of the other holidays, right? Rosh Hashanah is 5. All the Passover, Sukkot, Shavuot, 5. Yom Kippur, 6. Shabbat, 7. So that's how, and for all the other days, you cannot subdivide the portion any more than already is subdivided. So in other words, you can't add extra aliyot. Like you can on Shabbat, we would have an additional aliyah or an acharon or something like that in case we have extra honors to give out. Sometimes for a bar bat mitzvah, we make extra honors. Can't do that with the 5, 4, or 3 portion days. Can only do it with a Shabbat. But Shabbat, when it's a holiday, can't really subdivide it anymore either. The portion already is smaller than usual, and it's not set to subdivide anymore. So the portion for this Shabbat, first day of Passover, is divided into 7 portions instead of 5. But then Sunday, the second day of Passover, that portion will be 5 aliyot. Okay, and then during the week of Passover, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday are all the intermediate days of the holiday. There's a Torah portion that's read on those days, and it's 4 portions, 4 aliyot that are read. Okay, so just some logistical behind the scenes kind of understanding of Torah readings and how they work during different days of the year. So the portion for first day of Passover is taken from Exodus chapter 12, verse 21. And now I'll say the blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So in the Eitz Chaim, it's on page 385. In whatever edition of Chumash you're using, you want to look for Exodus chapter 12, beginning with verse 21. If you want, if it helps, it's the portion Bo, beginning with the 5th aliyah. Now, Exodus 12, 1-20, we read on Shabbat HaChodesh 2 weeks ago. So always the Shabbat right around the beginning of the month of Nisan is one of the special Shabbases before Passover. Second Torah is taken out of the ark, and we read Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 to 20. So now we're continuing, and for the first day of Passover, we read the 21 through 51. So what is essentially the fifth and sixth aliyot. Good morning, Jan. So I'm just saying that this Shabbat, we depart from our weekly Torah reading. We read instead what's allotted for the first day of Passover. So in the Eitz Chaim, we're on page 385. Whatever edition of Chumash we have, it's Exodus chapter 12, verses 21 to 51. Okay, so what I thought we would do is just read through it and understand then why the rabbis picked this for the first day of Passover, as opposed to anything else. And I think we'll see that it makes total sense why that is. All right, so Exodus 12, 1 to 20 was the preparation for departure from Egypt and for observing the first Passover holiday by designating a sheep or a goat and setting it aside, and preparing not to eat chametz, but to eat matzah instead. Okay, because verse 20, kol machmetzet lo tochelu, you shall not eat anything leavened, b'chol moshvotechem, in any of your dwelling places, tochlu matzot, you should eat matzah. Okay, that's verse 20. Now, verse 21. So this is where the portion begins. For Shabbat. Vayikra Moshe l'chol ziknei Yisrael, vayomer aleihem. Moses called to all the elders of Israel and said to them, Mishchu ukechu lachem son lemishpachotechem v'shachatu hapasach. Pull aside. So I'm translating literally. It says here, go pick out lambs. Mishchu means to pull. You should pull. Limshoch is pull. So on every door in Israel, it either says dechof, push, or mishoch, pull. So mishchu is the command, you plural, pull. So I would translate this, pull aside and take for you a sheep. So it says a lamb. So I would actually be more general with the translation, because goats and sheep fall into the category of the Hebrew word son, which would be flock. So animals that are kept in flocks would be sheep or goats. So pull aside and take one of the flocks for your families and slaughter the Passover sacrifice. Okay. Ulekachtem agudat ezov, and take a bundle of hyssop. Utevaltem badam asher basaf, and dip them, that is the bundles of hyssop, in the blood that is in the basin. So what is missing here is that after slaughtering the Passover sacrifice, which is the animal that was pulled aside, slaughtering it, the blood needs to be drained in a basin. Okay, so that seems to be implied here. And then the bundle of hyssop is dipped into that blood that was collected in the basin. Vihigatem el hamashkof, and touch it to the lintel, and to ve'el shtei hamezuzot, and to the two doorposts, min hadam asher basaf, from the blood that is in the basin, ve'atem lo tetzu, and you should not leave, ish mipetach beito ad boker, anybody from their house until the morning. So what's unclear is, are only the elders doing this or the entire population of Israel? I think it's the entire population of Israel. Moses is speaking to the elders, and then the elders are supposed to convey this message to everybody. Everybody pull aside an animal from their flock. Now, how did slaves have the opportunity to have a flock? So I'm not sure how that works. Like, were slaves allowed to have some property of their own in order to provide milk and cheese for their family? I really don't know. So, and I'm not sure that the commentary just assumes that people had this. So even though they were slaves and subject to being owned by their Egyptian masters, they might have had some property on their own, such as a small flock. So they're supposed to pull aside this lamb or this goat, and because it's really a lamb or a goat, not just a lamb, slaughter it, drain the blood into a basin, take a bundle of hyssop, which is a lowly kind of bush that was common throughout the Middle East, so readily available, and use that hyssop, this grassy-like bush branches, to kind of paint with the blood the doorposts. So it's the two doorposts and the above lintel. So it's not the threshold that's on the floor part of the door frame, but the three-sided rectangle with the lintel being the top post. So that's what they're supposed to paint with this blood of the lamb or the goat. And stay home until the morning. Stay inside. Okay, and why? Verse 23, Va'avar Adonai linagof et Mitzrayim, and God will pass by to plague or to strike Egypt. So the word magefa is a plague. Sometimes the mem in a Hebrew noun will fall and become a nun instead in the verb form. So lin gof is the verb form of magefa, which is plague. So God will, whatever the verb form of plague is, so strike or smite here. So God will pass by and or pass through and smite Egypt. Vera'ah et hadam, God will see the blood al hamashkof, on the lintel, ve'al shtei hamezuzot, and on the two doorposts, ufasach Adonai al hapetach, and will pass over, God will pass over the opening, velo yitain hamashchit, and will not allow the destroyer, lavo el batechem lingof, to enter your homes to smite. Okay, so the Pesach is the Passover offering to remind us how God and the destroying angel will pass over the homes that are so painted with the blood of the goat or the lamb. Okay, so it was a signal to the angel that this is an Israelite home, do not enter. Okay, so just a point of reference here. Lots of things that this chapter describes for us, we do today, and was done when the temple was standing in Jerusalem. So clearly we don't offer the Passover sacrifice anymore, right? That can only be done when there's a temple in Jerusalem. That's, the rabbis made clear that there's only one place to bring a sacrifice, and that's to the temple in Jerusalem. There are no alternate sacrifice sites once the temple was destroyed. But even when the temple was standing, post Exodus from Egypt, people did not paint their doors with the blood of the animal. Okay, so that kind of went away. That was a one-time deal, only happened in Egypt. But sacrificing a Passover lamb or goat would happen every year subsequent to this. Now, it didn't happen while they're traveling through the desert in Egypt. It's clear, according to the rabbis, that none of the holidays were observed in Egypt, and that, in fact, the Haftarah for the first day of Passover is a description of Joshua leading the people into Israel and celebrating Passover in the land of Israel for the very first time after 40 years wandering in the desert. Okay, no holidays in Egypt. So when it was done in the land of Israel, it was just the animal that was sacrificed, and no painting of the doorposts with the blood as a reminder. Okay, verse 24. Feel free to interrupt with a question at any time as we're reading through this. Ushmartem et hadavar hazeh, observe this or keep this thing, this matter, lechok lecha ulevanecha ad olam, as an ordinance, as a law, as a commandment for you and for your children forever. Okay, so this is why I'm commenting on this, that what part of this, if not all of this, is supposed to be done forever, right? Shouldn't we be, if it says here in verse 24 that we're supposed to have this matter, that is, slaughtering this lamb for Passover for all time, then that should mean to paint the doors with the blood also. Wasn't Shabbat observed in the desert? Yes. So I said no holidays were observed in the desert. Shabbat is different. Shabbat, yes. So it was 2 portions of manna. Wouldn't necessarily call them, oh, Jan is, I'm assuming everybody saw Jan's question. She wrote the question just to me, not to everyone. So wasn't Shabbat observed in the desert? 2 loaves of manna on Fridays. Yes, 2 portions of manna fell on Friday, and yes, Shabbat was observed, but no other holidays were observed in the desert. Okay, so it's just interesting that verse 24 says, observe this for all time. But the rabbis decided what about it would be observed for all time. Okay, so I just need to point that out, that it's the rabbis' interpretation of the Torah that makes for the what we're observing for all time. Verse 25, V'haya ki tava'u el haaretz, asher yitain Adonai lachem ka'asher diber, ushmartem et ha'avodah hazot. And it will come to pass when you enter the land that God will give to you, as he said, and you will observe, or you will guard, or you will keep this ritual. Okay, avodah here in this context, Eitz Chaim translates it as rite, R-I-T-E, ritual, worship, that kind of thing. Okay, so it's not just to be observed one time in Egypt, but to be observed for all time, or at least when you enter the land of Israel. So you could argue that that the holiday of Passover should only be observed in the land of Israel. But the rabbi said, no, wherever Jews live, we observe the holiday of Passover. 26, V'haya ki yomru aleichem b'neichem, and it will come to pass, and it will be, when your children say to you, Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem, what is this ritual for you? V'amartem zevach pesachu ladonai, and you should say, it is a Passover sacrifice to God. Asher pasach al batei b'nei Yisrael b'Mitzrayim, for passing over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, ben nogpo at Mitzrayim, when he struck Egypt, ve'et batenu hitzil, and our houses he saved, vayikod ha'am vayishtachavu, and the people bowed down and in homage. Okay, so the entire people heard this law and this ritual and understood that that they are what they are supposed to do in Egypt and what they are supposed to do from now on for all time, and that what's brought in here is the idea of what happens when your children ask, right? So this is the children asking is really only associated with the Passover story. Throughout the rest of the Torah, when other laws are presented, it's not presented in a way what to say to your children if they're to ask, right? So the animals, birds, and fish which were allowed to eat and not allowed to eat. If your children were to ask, why are we only supposed to ask? Why are we only supposed to eat these animal, birds, and fish? That doesn't come up in conversation. About Shabbat, all the times in the Torah that we're told to observe Shabbat, nothing about if your children happen to ask. So it's just fascinating. I don't have an answer to it because, yes, the entire people of Israel were involved in the Exodus from Egypt, but the entire people of Israel stood at Mount Sinai also and heard all the other laws too. So it's just fascinating that with all the laws presented here, the only time that the motif of if your children were to ask is associated only with the Exodus story. Okay, it's about putting on tefillin too, but the putting on tefillin for the first time comes in the next chapter, chapter 13, which is still here in Egypt. The people are still here in Egypt. Okay, so any other place in the Torah where that laws are presented, nothing about if your children were to ask, this is what you should say to them. So I just think it's fascinating. It's just something to think about. I don't have an answer for it. Just something to think about. And which is, of course, why children are incorporated into the Seder and take a major role, and in fact are given questions to ask in case they don't have questions to ask, right? We have the prayer book as a script for us to pray to God in case we don't have words handy to share with God. So too, you have the 4 questions, Manishtana, as 4 questions for children to ask, just in case they don't have questions of their own. Okay, so the Haggadah is the script for discussion and what to say at the Seder in case we can't come up with the script ourselves. Okay, so as long as we follow the highlights of the script, we're allowed to do whatever we want with the Haggadah. Okay, we got the blessings over the cups of wine. We have other particular lines. You have to point to the shank bone, to the matzah and the bitter herbs, and say what Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says to say about those 3 things. There are a couple things in the Haggadah that we're supposed to say, but other than that, we can feel free to go off script and do whatever we want about the Passover story and themes of the Passover story that are applied to us today in 2022. Okay, so here the idea then of children, what to say to the children. This is just one of the 4 times throughout the story that Passover is mentioned with children, what to say to children. That we have the basis for the 4 sons. right? The wise, the wicked, the not so smart, and one who doesn't know how to ask. So right, so all of these are based on verses themselves from the Torah. Okay, so right, if we look below the line here on 386, when your children ask you, this is the origin of the familiar Seder custom of having the children present ask the 4 questions. 3 references in this portion to telling the story to our children, and another in Deuteronomy gave rise to the Haggadah passage about the four sons or the 4 children. Exodus 13:8, you shall explain to your son, emphasizes the parents' role in informing children, even if they do not ask, gearing our information to the child's capacity for understanding. It's better to encourage children to ask questions while they are still at home, and parents and teachers can respond to them, than to wait until others cause them to doubt and to question. So just an interesting kind of point there below the line. Start education, parent to child young. Don't leave it to somebody else, or don't wait too long to be educating our children. Okay. So we know, yes, Saul.
Okay, so if this is something we should be doing for all time, and when you enter Israel, do they still do it today in Israel, and why not?
The Passover sacrifice, you mean? Do they do?
No, you kill a lamb and then you put the blood on
it. Right. So we don't do the sacrifice anymore. Okay, no, right. So this Passover sacrifice was independent of all the laws in Leviticus about bringing sacrifices. So yes, the question is a legitimate question. Maybe this Passover sacrifice should be different from all the other sacrifices that we learn about in the book of Leviticus, which include holiday sacrifices. Meaning, there's a regular holiday sacrifice that would be brought on Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, which on Passover is different from the Passover lamb sacrifice. So that's why we have an egg and a shank bone on the Seder plate. The shank bone is a reminder of the Passover the Paschal lamb sacrifice. The roasted egg is a reminder of the holiday sacrifice, which would have been brought on all the days of Passover, the 2 days of Shavuot, and all the days of Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, and Simchat Torah. Okay, so that's what the egg is for the regular holiday. The shank bone is for the special Paschal lamb, the Passover lamb. So this Passover lamb is independent of all the others. So why did the rabbis say that we can only do that with the temple is standing in Jerusalem? So I don't have a ready answer for you, Saul, about that. I think the answer is because the rabbis wanted to regulate and standardize how animals are slaughtered. So as opposed to Islam, which is the difference between halal and kosher, anybody in Islam is allowed to slaughter a lamb or a goat to eat it, as long as they do so by invoking the name of Allah. So any Muslim person is allowed to slaughter their sheep or goat or cow and invoke Allah's name, and then proceed to butcher the animal, and that meat then can be consumed by a Muslim and be considered halal meat. Now, it could very well be that between the time of the Torah until the time of the rabbis, all Israelites knew how to slaughter their animals, and all Israelites were allowed to do so. But the rabbis regulated it, and said while the temple was standing, only Kohanim could do it. So they said that all Israelites needed to bring their Passover lamb to the temple in Jerusalem, be huge crowds there, lots of Kohanim around, available to slaughter your lamb for you and to drain the blood appropriately, and then leave it up to you to then butcher, skin and butcher your animal and then roast it to be there in the temple precincts or somewhere in Jerusalem to be having your Passover meal. So the rabbis, I guess, in a form of regulation and standardization, said that we will not allow the average Israelite back home to slaughter their lamb. And there are many people post-temple do not eat lamb on Passover for this, as a sign of you're remembering, you're in mourning for the destruction of the temple. I think Sephardic Jews do eat lamb on Passover, and obviously we're allowed to buy lamb. There's kosher lamb available for Passover, but there are some Ashkenazi Jews who will not eat lamb on Passover as because we're in mourning, and will wait until the temple's rebuilt to eat lamb on Passover again. Okay, so I hope that answered your questions. That it's a matter of standardization from the rabbis. Okay, so let's go on. Verse 28. Vayelchu v'yasu b'nei Yisrael ka'asher tziva Adonai et Moshe v'Aaron ken asu. So the people of Israel went and did according to the commandment of God to Moses and Aaron, so they did. Okay, so even though it was the elders who received the commandment, the entire people of Israel, according to this verse, received the commandment, and this is what they did on Passover Eve. Okay, so now this is what happens that night. Verse 29, the start of the sixth Aliyah, page 387. Vayehi b'chatzi halayla, and it came to pass in the middle of the night. So chatzi in modern Hebrew means half. It can also mean middle. So it's not it is midnight technically. So midnight, according to our watch, is 12 a.m. But midnight, according to the rabbis and ancient Israelites, is the middle of the night. So you take the nighttime hours from the time that 3 stars are seen in the sky until the crack of dawn. You divide that amount of time in half, and that for the rabbis is the middle of the night. Okay, so the middle of the night is a different time depending on the time of year that it is. Okay, so just a little bit of astronomical kind of logistics here. So it came to pass in the middle of the night, Va'adonai hika kol bechor be'eretz Mitzrayim, that God struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, mi bechor Paro, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, hayoshev al kiso, who sits on his throne, ad bechor hashavi, until to the firstborn of the captive, Asher Beveit Habor, who's in prison or in the dungeon. Beit Habor. A bor is a pit. So the house of the pit. So that's why it's translated as a dungeon. To the firstborn of the captive who's in the dungeon. V'chol bechor behema, and all the firstborn of all cattle. So God struck down all the firstborn, no matter wealth, status, in the land of Egypt. Vayakom Paro Laila Hu. Pharaoh rose up that night, V'chol Abadav, V'chol Mitzrayim, and all his servants and all of Egypt. V'tehi tza'aka gedola b'Mitzrayim, and there was a huge cry or shout in Egypt. Ki ein bayit asher ein sham mate, because there wasn't a house that didn't have a dead body in it. So it's as if all of Egypt cried out at once. Vayikra leMoshe u'la'Aaron, and he called to Moses and Aaron, Lila. This is Pharaoh. Pharaoh called to Moses and Aaron that night, Vayomer, and said, Kumu tse'u mitoch ami, get up and get out from among my nation. Gam atem, gam b'nei Yisrael, ulechu ivdu et Adonai kedaberchem. You and the children of Israel, go and worship Adonai as you spoke, or as you wanted to. Right. So now imagine, this is Pharaoh. His firstborn son just died inexplicably, and he's calling to Moses and Aaron. Right? He doesn't send a messenger saying to do this. It's more, he calls them in the midst of his grief and said, get out of here, and all your people, and just do whatever you want. Just get out of my sight and leave Egypt entirely. Gam somchem, gam bekarchem, kechu ka'asher dibartem valechu. Also your flock and your cattle, or your herds, your flocks and your herds, take according to what you've said, and go uverachtem gamoti, and bless also me. Possibly Pharaoh giving in here, recognizing that there is a power above that is greater than him, that he wasn't willing to recognize before throughout the previous 9 plagues. So now he's recognizing it and asking for God's blessing from Moses and Aaron. Clearly, they've won the day, and clearly this God is more powerful than Pharaoh, and he's asking for a blessing. 33. Vatechazak Mitzrayim al ha'am lemaher leshalcha min haaretz. Egypt urged the people to quickly get out. Well, what does it say here? The Egyptians urged the people on, impatient to have them leave the country. That's a better way of working the Hebrew words here. Yeah, they urged them quickly to get out, to be cast out from the land. Ki amru kulanu metim, because they said we're all dead. So they wanted all of Israel out of Egypt quickly. So that maybe this plague will, the more Israel stays, the more damage and injury and death there'll be in Egypt. So get out quick. 34. Vayisa ha'am et betseko terem yachmatz. The people took their dough before it rose, or before it was leavened. Mish arotam, Sirurot besimlotam, their kneading bowls were wrapped up, bundled up in their garments, al shichmam, on their shoulders. Uvenei Yisrael asu kidvar Moshe, and the people of Israel did according to Moses' words. Vayish alu mimitzrayim, and they asked from Egypt, klei chesef uchlei zahav usmalot, vessels of silver and vessels of gold and garments. Now, this makes us look really bad. So it's one thing to win in this cruel and harsh manner. It's another thing, while the people are down, to be asking for silver and gold and fine garments. It's just, I personally, reading this, think this is awful. Why couldn't they just get out of town? Why did they have to get out before getting out of town? You know what? You really want us out? I'd like to have some gold and silver, please. Just I don't know. Just leaves a bad taste. And also, it's understood later in the book of Exodus that the entire Mishkan, the tabernacle itself, was built with these very vessels. Okay, so this gold and silver that they took from the Egyptians, that the Egyptians had no need of in the heat of the moment, was then used for the tabernacle. I don't know. What does that say about the tabernacle? What does that say? It just, I don't know. It just leaves a very bad taste. And so now let's look below the line here. Jules, did you have a question, or I saw your hand? No. Okay. So if we look below the line here for 35, see what the commentary says about this. The silver and gold given, not lent, by the Egyptians constituted a protest against the policies of the royal tyrant. That's reading a lot into this. That the Egyptians, by giving the gold and the silver, was a matter of protest. Also the gold for the golden calf as well. Yes. The silver and gold here already understood as a protest against Pharaoh. They demonstrated a renewal of public conscience. In other words, all right, enough of this slavery. It's clearly because they were slaves that all these plagues happened. They're finally achieving freedom. So let's give them the gold and silver to recognize they were right and slavery was wrong. I read so Laurie's saying, I read an interpretation of Rabbi Sachs about how this could be a precedent for compensation for slaves. It would not make them whole, but acknowledge the oppression. Right. This whole idea of reparations. It's tough. And how long do you wait for reparations? How many generations down do reparations go? So in Germany today, Holocaust survivors are receiving reparations. So there's a whole legal framework in which people had to apply for reparations to Germany, but there are thousands of people receiving reparations today from Germany. So Israel, there are many who live in Israel. Even the state of Israel received reparations. In other words, in the early 50s, a lot of machinery, weaponry, industrial infrastructure came from Germany as a way of building up the country of Israel, as a way of Germany saying they're sorry for what they did during the Holocaust. So it was back in the 70s. It's not such a big deal anymore, but back in the 70s, you'd see so many German products all around Israel, and this would be in a time when my parents refused to buy anything German. I don't think that's the case anymore, but I grew up knowing not to buy anything German. We would never think about buying a Volkswagen, let alone an Audi or a BMW or a Mercedes-Benz. How dare we help those industrial giants who actually provided the machinery for concentration camps and the annihilation of the 6 million? How can we allow them to profit off of our money? So so many Mercedes-Benz taxis back in the 70s. That's right. So it's reparations, but it was also about the Israel Philharmonic never playing Wagner, would never play Wagner, and they only started playing Wagner maybe within the past 10 years. And so there are many Holocaust survivors and others who would attend Israel Philharmonic in Israel. And if Zubin Mehta, because he was the longtime conductor of the Israel Philharmonic, if he ever started, because he tried to play Wagner every now and then, an uproar in the audience about it, and he'd have to stop. They couldn't play. So anyway, so already below the line here, We're already interpreting this, the gold and silver, as if the Egyptians themselves were doing it willingly and as a sign of protest against Pharaoh and a sign of awakening their conscience. So now it goes on. Similar gifts were given to the Jews leaving Babylonia to return to Judea. Now, in Babylonia, Jews were not slaves. They were living in exile. So it's a little bit different. It was forced exile. But still, if you look at the book of Ezra, you'll see that they were showered with gifts when they were allowed to head back to Israel. Had the Israelites left Egypt with nothing, after so many years of suffering, the hatred in their hearts toward the Egyptians would have been never ending. Okay, so that's another midrash. Really? They needed to have this. So it was, now the book of Esther has killing as part of this revenge, right? Haman's plot was stopped at the last minute, but still the Jews were allowed to kill Persians on the day that Haman was going to kill the Jews. So there's bloodlust there. There's no bloodlust here. So is this better than bloodlust? Right? In other words, we're not told here that Israelites on their way out killed their Egyptian taskmasters or any other Egyptian. That did not happen. So perhaps this is better than killing the Egyptians, that just looting them instead. The Torah, the commentary goes on, the Torah wanted the Egyptian people to send them off with gifts so that it would be easier for the Israelites to fulfill the mitzvah, you shall not abhor an Egyptian. Okay, so maybe it's easier today, right? So in other words, is it harder today to forgive the German than it is to forgive the Egyptian, to not abhor the Egyptian, because we got money, we got silver and gold from the Egyptians, but we got nothing from the Germans. After the fact, we got reparations from the Germans. So does that make it easier not to abhor Germans today? And I tell you, ironically, like I said in Jews in the News on Monday, it is Germany that is the safest place to be Jewish in Europe today. So I wouldn't have any problem buying anything German myself today, because I think Germany has done what would be expected of a country overcoming its evil past. It teaches, it's in the curriculum in German public schools to be aware of the Nazi past and to overcome it. They have what are they called? The Feppelstein, these cobblestones that are in different towns around Germany with the name of the person who in front of the house that used to be Jewish-owned property. So you have these cobblestones all around Germany in various cities and towns that have the name of the previous owner there. So people are always aware of their past. So I think that is the way it should be done, as opposed to France, who continues to hide the fact that they were accomplices to the Vichy government was an accomplice to Hitler and Nazi Germany, and the French rail system refuses to acknowledge that its role in transporting Jews to concentration camps. So, in fact, because I remember a few years ago, the state of California, in determining contract for a new rail system, has said that the French rail system is not allowed to be dealt with because they haven't come to terms with their Nazi past. So it's all about coming up with acknowledging the past and allowing us as the victim to be able to achieve a sense of not necessarily normalcy, but at least to feel better about doing business with and relating with the enemy. So now the parentheses here in the comment, this comment is by Benno Jacob, who was born and grew up in Germany and had to escape to England after the Nazis came to power. He understood that the purpose of the commandment was to cleanse our memory of bitterness and hatred. Right. So it's one thing as a Holocaust survivor that to have a level of hatred to one's to the enemy, and then the rest of us, by extension, as the family of Holocaust survivors, the extended family, what we feel towards the enemy. So anyway, I leave us with that today. Again, the rest of this chapter is the rest of the Torah reading for the first day of Passover. I wish everybody a happy and a healthy Passover. Stay safe, enjoy the holiday, hopefully you'll be with family and friends, and a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, as they say, and we'll see you next Wednesday for Torah study.
Thank you.